Okay, good afternoon. Welcome back. Welcome to the Global Pan-African People's Intervention and U.S. African Leaders Summit. As we stated before, this People's Intervention is one opportunity to clarify the relations between the U.S. government and African peoples. Our presentation for this panel on food, health, and climate are the following. First, we have Julialynne Walker, who is a Pan-African food sovereignty activist based in Columbia, Ohio. She formerly served as chair for Global Pan-African Movement and as rapporteur for the 8th Pan-African Congress in Ghana, and with the local organizing committee for the World Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and other related intolerances in South Africa. Our second panelist is Ousseina Alidou, is a professor of African Studies at Rutgers University, and she's online, past president of the African Studies Association, 2021-2022. Her research focuses on women in African Muslim society in the Republic of Niger and Kenya. Third panelist is Imani Countess. She directs the U.S. Africa Bridge Building Project, a new initiative launched in January 2021. She has spent more than 30 years in U.S. policy, foreign policy, working primarily with civil society groups, social movements, and governments in Africa. We request that you hold your comments and questions until the speakers are finished presenting. My name is Nisbett of Global Pan-African Movement, University of Cape Coast and Syracuse University. Thank you, and please welcome our first speaker, Julialynne.
Thank you very much, Mario. And thank you those who were able to be here in person, as well as those who are online. Today is December 10th, International Human Rights Day. And it's very, it's relevant that we're reading today because the question of what is a human right is very important when we begin to talk about food. So for many Americans, basically when you talk about the Constitution, people look at, think about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what does it take to actually live, to have a good life? And when the League of Nations and then the United Nations were established, there was a distinction made between human rights and the social or economic or political rights. And unfortunately, the right to health, the right to life does not sit within the human right, except in a very specific conversation. So today we're looking at food as a human right and one that should be considered in that context. We're also looking at the intersection of the right for food with other rights. And there are some who say that if Martin Luther King had not been shot in Memphis, he would have been shot in Washington, D.C. Why is that? Because the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, had experienced a lot of discussion in the spring of 1968 in terms of, was it appropriate for a civil rights organization to begin to address labor issues, specifically the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis? And it is to Dr. King's credit that he not only agreed, but supported the notion wholeheartedly, because he recognized the intersection of labor, human rights, and civil rights. And so as we review this, we also recognize that very early, there's been discussion that environmental justice, environmental rights is not an issue for Africans and the people of African descent. that somehow this is a middle class, or if you will, white right that is only relevant to certain people. And it is to Dr. King's credit, as well as a number of the activists who succeeded him, who joined the question of civil rights for environmental justice and recognized that the work that is done by all of us is an environmental issue. Where we live, where we work, where we play, and even where we pray. All right. So what are we looking at now? We're talking about environmental justice. It's to achieve two things: fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, class, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that everyone, regardless of where they live, should be entitled to the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and be allowed equal access to the decision-making process for a healthy environment. And as we move into the discussion around food, this becomes very important. Do we have equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment? Currently, many people, for both the right and the wrong reasons, are focused on intersectionality, or the idea that all social justice issues are linked. This term was coined in 1989 when Professor Kimberly Crenshaw used it in an academic essay about how race and gender intersect in Black feminism. Although other activists, such as Dr. King, were proponents of intersectionality in civil rights and social justice, the link, the formalization of the link has been slow to develop. So as long as people of color, Black people, low-income communities, or people living in poverty, not just in the United States, but around the world, are suffering from the climate crisis, and we do not address it, then those who live in more predominantly affluent areas or areas that are characterized by other ethnicities, we will not succeed in combating the climate crisis without an intersectional approach. So now, when we talk about the impact of racial inequalities, one of the things that's been brought home very closely for me recently is the fact that for far too many people of color, the impact of environmental injustice impacts us even before we are born. And that for far too many African American women and African women on the continent and other communities, because of the impact of two main issues, air pollution and heat exposure, many women do not bring their pregnancies to term. So the children are either stillborn, or they suffer premature labor, or they're born as underweight babies. So without a voice at all in being able to address the conditions in which we're born, we're losing our future, right? And so part of the discussion when we talk about bringing different groups into the conversation, we know that we really have to look at all vulnerabilities, even those we may not have considered before. And so when we talk about food, there's a scale of involvement specifically that goes from food security to food justice to food sovereignty. And we recognize that for many areas, particularly in the United States, and one of the questions was, what is happening on the ground? When we look at historically the issues around redlining, which has been the systematic placement of African people poor people in specific communities around the United States. And then when people have been denied funding, be able to purchase homes or even to rent other areas of the city, that we look specifically, there's a thread of areas that have been redlined, to areas that are now suffering food insecurities, to areas that are also what are called heat islands. And so the areas that have been redlined and suffered underdevelopment, the areas that are food insecure because of underdevelopment, are heat islands because of underdevelopment. And the heat island concept is that because there are the high degree of the size of the buildings, the form of the buildings, and the inability to get fresh air to a community, and the lack of tree canopy means that many poor communities are actually 5 to 10 degrees higher for a food. And so this correlation between the historic redlining, to food insecurities, to environmentalism becomes very clear to us. So food justice is centered on providing food communities with access to healthy food within existing systems, while understanding that although the food system is problematic and exploitative, addressing limited gains is appropriate. Food justice is centered on providing communities with access to healthy food. So food justice activists, for instance, when we talk about the food insecurities, and that is, does a community have access to food within a 1 mile radius? And is that food affordable and nutritious? And the fact of the matter of that is that close to 50% of African American populations are food insecure because they do not have access to nutritious, affordable food within a 1 mile radius. And so very often the fight at the level is to have a grocery store. That's what's fun. Love fighting for a grocery store. Food sovereignty, on the other hand, empowers communities to fight food injustices through grassroots activism. There was a discussion from the earlier panel, Church Quarterly 2, coalition building, while also recognizing that the food system itself is intertwined with the exploitation of marginalized communities and capitalist approaches to food production, distribution, and consumption. So one of the things that's happening that's very common right now is the free produce giveaways. And the free produce giveaways are really supporting, are firmly intertwined with the capitalist system of food production and distribution throughout the country. And so it's really, the final analysis, not about providing nutritious and affordable food, even though it's free, because very often the food that is provided is not necessarily nutritious. It is not, even in terms of the distribution areas, it isn't necessarily provided appropriately, and it isn't necessarily food that people have the resources even to prepare, whether or not they actually eat that food, meaning is it a part of their diet home. So there are a number, but at the end of the day, the food banks are taking tax credits from for receiving the donations. The corporations are receiving tax credit for giving the donations, and the agencies that are distributing are receiving benefit either death and tax credits, but then through increasing their local profile so that they have access to grant monies for other supportive activities. But at the end of the day, there has been no fundamental change in the health status of the relevant communities. And I've gotten I'm 10 minutes in.
Yes.
So I'll do one thing. Okay. So part of the discussion also that we have to recognize is there's some people that have used the phrase food justice is racial justice. And that's sometimes used to underscore the importance of African-American relationships to the land and the fact that that relationship is problematic because of the trauma that has been associated with the land over time. And so in order to change the perspective, we have to be able to address the trauma. And we have to be able to do that sometimes in somewhat creative ways. One of the discussions that I would have linked more fully is that in the context of food sovereignty, how do we use existing mechanisms to also address reparative justice? And I just want to briefly bring to your attention the Justice for Black Farmers bill, which was passed by the Congress last year, and which for the first time recognized the role of the U.S. government through the Department of Agriculture and the Federal Farm Services Agency in denying Black people, particularly in the South, access to the land, access to loans, and access to technical assistance to provide to develop the property that they did have. And because of this systematic discrimination, the bill was passed, and it specifically called for, one, access to the land. And it said very specifically that there would be a fund within the Department of Agriculture that would allow any individual of African descent up to 120 acres, and the federal government would pay for that land once the individual had identified it. Then the HBUs, as well as other selected universities, tertiary institutions, would also provide a curriculum that would allow for people to learn farming. And then thirdly, there would be a context for technical assistance. This is important for us in the context of reparative justice because it really talks about transforming society and society's resources in the interest of addressing this particular problem. And it is doing so in a way that allows people to be self-sufficient afterwards, as opposed to dependent on existing resource. And so this Mario is all right. Let me okay. I've got two other people coming. I don't want to set a bad example by going over more than I have. So I will stop here and say that just to end to say that the discussion of food sovereignty does include a discussion around food justice. And it means that we hopefully will recognize not only the historic contributions that various African communities have made through the indigenous knowledge systems in which we develop specific food pathways on the continent. Much of that knowledge followed us through human trade here. Much of it has been incorporated through existing contemporary agricultural practices, and there have been specific individuals who made historic contributions. This is all part of the process that needs to be recaptured as we address the specific need to ensure that all of us have access to affordable, nutritious food.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so now we move to the next presenter who's online. So this is Professor Ousseina Alidou. Please welcome our next presenter.
Hello.
Okay, yes. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And I just want to begin by really expressing my gratitude to Professor Horace Gamble and Professor for inviting me to join this really important and timely conference, and also Professor Krista Johnson, our host, and Professor Nisbett, who has been very helpful, and all the panelists and audience. I'm grateful to be in dialogue with you. So I'm grateful to follow after the previous panel, which looks at really Congo, Libya, and the geopolitics. And then now the first panelist, Ms. Julia Walker, for really addressing the question of the tension between how to approach life, Black lives, African lives, from the point of view of food sovereignty and social justice, rather than looking at African and Black lives from the point of view of a manufactured crisis of food and the land dispossession. So the work that I do as a linguist is to look at how the humanistic data can complement social scientists data, political scientists, and also human rights issues by looking at how African youth from both underprivileged communities, communities that have been dispossessed of their land, and whose children are pushed into a life of precarity through a treacherous migration across the Sahara and the Mediterranean Sea. How are the youth who remain try to capture the reality of life in Africa through the use of popular culture, particularly hip-hop songs and performances, and also other kind of communicative alternative. And I'm so glad that the previous panelist has articulated the need to really consider other kind of media platform in trying to capture African voices, Black voices, and our responses to issues of social justice. So the conversation I'm going to focus on is how African youth engaged in a popular culture are using that platform to articulate the plight of the majority of the population who are suffering from deprivation of public health access, food, and also vaccine nationalism inflicted by the global north, to see how in the reality on the ground this condition is presented by these other social justice activists who are the youth who are communicating and appropriating African vernacular communication strategies and global Black vernacular communication strategies to speak to the masses that are disenfranchised during the COVID pandemic, and also to call upon the attention of the global community through ethical framework of social justice. So because of the limitation of time, I would just quickly look at how what happens under condition of dismantling of public health services triggered by the imposition of neoliberal policies. What are the Africans, especially the underprivileged communities, how are they dealing with, how are they responding? What are the resources they have to respond to the health need during the pandemic? It is significant to look at the ways in which the songs articulate how Africans are resorting to African pluralistic healing practices, which include the spiritual, the traditional medicine, and also Western biomedical drugs when available, in their quest to protect themselves against the pandemic. It is important to highlight that more than 80% of African population cannot afford the cost of expensive prescription drugs, and in general do not have access to a public health infrastructure, even the COVID pandemic. As a result, they rely more on traditional healing practices. Although health care is considered a basic human right by the World Health Organization's constitutions of 2017, African countries have been led by neoliberal institutions to adopt reforms in the health sector that have caused the deterioration of a basic public healthcare system were pushing for privatization, which has produced health inequalities and the stratification of healthcare services. Neoliberal policies focus on economic rather than health human rights. They have therefore produced a category of disempowered people whose health needs are subordinated to the market. The imposition of out-of-pocket payment policies have systematically excluded the majority of the underprivileged population, unemployed and low-income classes without the financial means to access privatized healthcare controlled by multinational predatory insurance companies. Salcerio and Retoro have argued that, quote, neoliberal reform can be seen as a form of structural violence, disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable part of the population and curtailing access to basic rights, such as healthcare. Under such predatory health policy, the economically underprivileged result in massive numbers to affordable alternative care system rooted in indigenous plant medical and healing traditions. In line of this argument, then, Bogona Inyara, the executive director of Africa Europe Faith and Justice, further elaborates upon the structural violence of the structural adjustment program with regard to Africa. I quote, in the last 3 decades, the international health and aid policies towards Africa have been disastrous for healthcare delivery and universal access. International health policies have resulted in expensive healthcare for the rich and fragmented, ineffective services for the poor. As a result, large segments of the population continue to suffer unnecessary casualties, pain, and impoverishment. The World Bank dismissed as irrelevant, quote, the provision of comprehensive healthcare in public services. Many intellectuals endorse this neoliberal perspective. And so as the pandemic, unfortunately, when the pandemic hit, then the African condition is such that the majority of the population who cannot pay, cannot have access to basic healthcare as themselves. So what about us? So it is this disastrous consequences of neoliberal reform of African public healthcare system is a violence against the common good. And again, I want to quote Irina here, who suggests that Africa will not reach already before the pandemic any of the healthcare Millennium Development Goals or objectives. The curbing of public health services to a limited number of diseases have been a failure, even in case of those few diseases like HIV/AIDS that have received a lot of investment. In Africa, nearly half of the population, 48%, still has no access to essential medicine. So when we look at, as Mr. Walker has mentioned, we should not really maintain a definition of human rights which does not include health rights and also land rights, because when we're dealing with the question of health in the face of diseases such as the corona or the COVID and HIV or Ebola, nutrition is very critical in combating the disease. So what happens where you do not have access to land and you do not have access to food and you do not have access to basic medication, and you have to be confronted with issues of this COVID pandemic. So because of the nature of time, I want to say that the lockdown, African governments have adopted a lockdown without also looking at the intersectionally, as this previous speaker suggested, that health and well-being through nutrition and through economic resources are very important to what are the material relief system put in place before the adoption of lockdown. This has not been examined intersectionally. And so when we examine the songs and the performances that these young African artists are the narrative that they're presenting, they present a narrative that deconstructs in a very significant way all these conditions of economic violations and social violation and of human dignity that very often is not presented in the mainstream media or in a global north engagement with a corrupt political elite in the African context. So the songs, the narratives highlights that, well, the COVID-19 is a disease that cut across class and does not spare political elite who use the resources, national resources and revenues to hop in plane and go look for, to attend to their private health needs. In this case, the lockdown is also the lockdown on the political elite. So when you look at the political satire, the cartoons and the songs, those are the elements that this youth are highlighting. So social distancing, therefore, that's the lockdown, the social distancing and lockdown present a huge challenge to underprivileged population who must work outside their home. This includes the majority of people working in the informal sector as the petty traders and as unskilled laborers. In spite of the warning about the presence of soldiers and police to reinforce the lockdown, the media have reported several violent confrontations in places like Nigeria, Niger, and other places between state security forces and some citizens who argue that they have no resources to feed their families and therefore cannot remain at home as required by the lockdown policy unless they receive government food and material relief. Nigerians continue to protest, for instance, in several cities, including Kano, Kaduna, Lagos, as well as other cities and towns, despite the violent response of the state's armed security, which led to the death of several people between March 2020 and April 20, according to the Nigerian Human Rights Commission to Reuters International. Well, Amnesty International has reported on the deprivation and death of prisoners in Kaduna State. Invoking compassion and understanding the plight of the economically underprivileged is what the artists note in their songs. And one of the lyrics, which I quote, says, "If the poor is asked to stay home, there is hardship with the lack of millet, flour for the family meal of his wife and children, and his wife and children will not be happy." So the use here of millet as the staple food is a metaphor, using a vernacular metaphor to address the issue of food insecurity, which Ms. Walker has presented in the African-American context. It's not different from what the African on the continent are also experiencing. So looking at those lyrics will allow us to see the ways in which socioeconomic and issues of deprivation about land and access to water. The COVID pandemic is a pandemic that also requires access to water, and that the struggle over access to water has been really a critical dimension of injustices imposed upon Africans that need to be re-examined, because the extractive industries are appropriating water resources. Therefore, agriculture and agricultural spaces need to be addressed in this configuration. Thank you so much. I want to stop here for the purpose of time, so that we can have more discussion at the end. Since we are given 10 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, Professor, thank you.
It's okay.
Considering the time. We perhaps will have a fruitful conversation after to add to the time, that limited time that you have. Okay, so now we have our last presenter, Imani Countess, and she's also on Zoom. So please welcome Imani Countess for the next presentation.
Good morning. I want to express a sincere thanks to Professor Campbell for inviting me to this event, and to Professor Krista Johnson and the Howard University African Studies family for hosting this event, and to Professor Nisbett for his skillful moderating. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to share thoughts on workers and social protection, which is the theme that Professor Campbell asked me to discuss. And more importantly, I really look forward to listening and learning from my co-panelists, as well as the participants in the room and online. As was noted, I direct a small initiative, the US-Africa Bridge Building Project. Much of our work is focused on raising awareness of the impact of illicit financial flows from Africa and the devastating impacts of the debt crisis and unfair tax systems. These issues directly impact African workers. Illicit financial flows cost the continent an estimated $88 billion per year, monies that would have boosted government revenue for sustainable development. Tax structures that make it easy for multinationals, particularly those in the extractive sector, to pay little to no tax while demanding tax breaks from governments and local communities. The debt crisis that, along with tax and illicit financial flows, contributes to Africa's underdevelopment. And in this context of deep structural economic inequality, all workers are deeply impacted. And the ability of governments to adequately fund social protection measures, public health, social security, and social welfare programs is undermined. According to the International Labor Organization, African governments are politically committed to social protection. And in fact, many governments have protections built into their legislative frameworks. But the ILO reports that social protection coverage remains limited in Africa, where only 17% of the total population receives at least one social protection benefit, compared with the global average of 47%. That leaves 1.2 billion Africans without any social protection coverage. A comprehensive strategy is needed to bridge that gap. And the ILO and the African Union have come together to develop and launch a strategy. But unless that strategy includes a focus on industrialization, gender equality, and changing the global economic architecture that facilitates the exploitation of African resources, I believe that government's ability to institute meaningful social protection is limited. Regarding workers, first, I think it's really important just to talk a little bit about who we're talking about. I mean, in essence, we're kind of talking about everybody, right? Because we all work, right? Or we're dependent upon those who work. We're talking about people in formal jobs, those with employment contracts or agreements, who receive benefits and have some level of representation. And we're talking about informal economy workers who make up the largest percentage of workers in Africa. The reality is that if you don't have formal employment, you figure out a way, right? You make a way to support yourself and your family. And when we travel to the continent, we see the informal economy everywhere. Yes, in the markets and street vendors and cross-border traders, but it's not just the markets. The construction workers are mainly informal. There are small businesses that are informal, repair shops. If I, for example, go to Zimbabwe and if I'm living there and I need a table or whatever, I can go to a retail store, or I can go to an area in Harare where carpenters congregate and work. I can buy a table there from the workers themselves, or go to a retail store that sources materials from those workers, right? So some will call these workers in this part of the informal economy, they'll call them micro entrepreneurs. I think a more helpful designation is that many informal workers are entrepreneurs by necessity, right? As opposed to having some, deep driving desire to be a sole proprietor. Most informal workers would prefer to be employed with health insurance, pension, and a standard benefits package, but those jobs are few and far between. Some jobs in the sector are more precarious than others and skirt the edges of legality. For example, artisanal mining in many countries is illegal. And in some areas where it's legal or illegal, the mining tends to feed into corrupt practices, particularly in the diamond and gold sectors. Africa has a notable history of trade unionism, particularly instrumental during the decolonization and national liberation efforts. Unions and worker organizations played significant roles in those struggles, and probably COSATU in South Africa is the most well-known example. Today, Africa's post-colonial economy is weakened by neoliberalism and the enforcement mechanisms of the international financial institutions, backed by the power of multinational corporations, and the resultant deindustrialization of the continent have, in many countries, marginalized unions and the workers they represent. But African unions exist and are finding ways to grow, to challenge governments, to use the mechanisms of the ILO and continent-wide formations to really figure out ways to represent their members and workers more broadly. That work, however, requires setting aside or expanding the basic foundations of the global labor movement. Foundational concepts historically have been based upon industrial relationships with a focus on working conditions, wages, and representation. Structures that are based upon a shared position within the organization of production. Approaches that in Africa are insufficiently grounded and that have lost ground to the reality of precarious and informal employment. One of the ways that laborers have mobilized is to expand the understanding of who's a worker, right? And how do you represent workers outside of industrial relationships? Unions here in the United States are facing similar questions in relation to what we call, we might call the gig economy, right? Which is the economy in most of Africa. Unions acknowledging the informality, the growing informality of work, have for more than 20 years organized to create community-based unions, informal economy unions, and have sought to kind of recognize their responsibility to work on behalf of unaffiliated workers and advocate for protections, conditions, and strong labor laws that advance all workers. Africa's deindustrialization and the growth of the informal sector are barriers, right, to the growth and stability of Africa's union. Another element that I think is really important to mention, it's internal to unions and to broader society, is gender inequality. You cannot build a house if 50% of the foundation is marginalized, violated, or harassed, and women are systematically marginalized in formal and informal unions and labor organizations. Union efforts towards inclusion and gender equality in formal and informal structures has been more talk than action, while women's work is more precarious, lower paid, and women bear the brunt of gender-based violence in the workplace and in society. In 2014, I worked for an international labor organization, and our team conducted a study that noted that there's wide awareness in unions of the need to advance gender equality, and there was at that time significant progress, but the results were, fell short of full equality, and that in order to achieve a higher level of gender equality, efforts needed the support of international actors as well as pressures from women workers themselves and from sympathetic male leaders. The study found that unions specifically had a tendency to accept only token representation of women's leadership, with a particular concentration of posts dealing with gender issues. In light of that 2014 finding, our team worked to develop 3 years of programming to explore how programs might shift power relationships in unions from the tendency to accept token representation to relationships where women have power, control, and ability to negotiate within union structures and with employers, particularly those unions that are dominated, right, by women. So following this 3-year effort, we did an assessment, and we were able to expand upon that initial study to note, one, like the success of the extraordinary woman, right? We've all seen and can identify women in every field who, because of their perseverance and their determination, and they just rise, right? They are known, they become known qualities, and that holds true for the labor movement as well. We also saw how women would come together in unions to really focus on building power within institutional structures, sort of creating spaces where they were still marginalized and largely still focused on gender, so, quote unquote, women's issues, but they were formalized. So women's caucuses, women's wings of the labor movement. We also saw women coming together to create safe spaces, not caucuses or wings, but women within unions who just needed to come together in a safe space where they could just be, share stories, get advice, and so forth. In one situation, we saw an example of women and their allies being able to call out inequality, harassment, and abuse of power, and successfully work to put structures and policies in place to address those issues. But that work, we found after this 3-year effort, it did not achieve a shift from tokenism to control. There were some advances. There were moves to placate women or to delegate, again, power without budget or authority. But at the end of the day, the desired shift, the change leading to increased power within unions and increased control over union resources, policies, and priorities didn't occur. So without a doubt, the overarching economic issues and internal challenges, right, including addressing gender inequality and patriarchy, are challenges that continue to confront workers and the structures that represent them. Globally, I think there's a tendency to focus on the global economic architecture, which has to be front and center. But at the same time, there is a need to really ensure that we are paying attention to and aggressively working towards eliminating the inequalities that exist within our own structures. And thank you.
Thank
I
you.
know
for-
I'm standing between everybody and lunch, so. You know.
Well, thank you for your presentation and your time. Okay, now, so quickly we'll open up the question to the audience, both in person and online, and we'll have a round of questions so the different panelists could address particular questions of different amount of questions.
Thank you so much. I was really interested in the concept of, I was really interested in the problem of need-based entrepreneurship. What was the first step to, bringing a more comfortable environment for competition?
Say it again, please.
For the problem of necessity-driven entrepreneurship, I was wondering what the policy, like, what the next step is basically to try to create more comfortable conditions for people who find the need to pursue that as a lifestyle, as opposed to other things that might take.
Okay. Any more questions? Yes, please.
I think the question related to sort of the informal economy, but I was just wondering if someone could restate it. The microphone broke up.
Okay, okay.
Let me use the mic.
Right.
Yes, hi, I'm Angelique Walker-Smith from Bread for the World in Washington, D.C. And one of the priorities we have is working with Black farmers here and globally in the Pan-African state. I'm very grateful for these presentations, and particularly to the first. We talked about food sovereignty, moving to food sovereignty. I am very pleased to see this movement have more leadership going forward based on the work that we're doing at Bread for the World. I'm Senior Associate for Pan-African Engagement. I should have said that. My question is, where do you see the interface of the African Union and the New Free Trade Agreement playing a role in increasing the movement around particularly women of African descent and of Africa, because the African Union includes the 6 regions of people of African descent, as well as the other 5 regions, and particularly as we're thinking about the summit that's taking place this week. Very interested to know what your comments are on that. One of the legislative acts that Bread for the World was at the forefront of was the AGOA Act. And of course, people talk about AGOA, but they don't always talk about AWEB. So I'd be interested in your comments about AWEB as well as the AGOA, which is really supposed to be about women entrepreneurship. As we think about particularly women of African descent. Thank you.
Let's get that one. Then we will. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. I just had a question for like all 3 panelists in regards to food, labor movement, and hip hop artists or the hip hop music industry. We see a lot of African culture in these 3 dynamics. When it comes to food, we try to, I know here, Africans here, we want to eat food that was, we eat food from the motherland and incorporate that food. And hip hop music, some of us have some hip hop artists like Burna Boy, or some of the popular hip hop artists, they wear African garments. But my question to you all is, how can we put a more focus, a political focus, a more scientific socialist focus into these three arenas, not just, like calling it what it is, capitalism and imperialism, and how can we use these three areas, as in food, as in hip hop artists, as in the labor movement is already attacking that system in a sense, but how can we connect the focus more to a scientific socialist approach, and incorporating the politics of Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba and making that connection among Africans around the world.
Okay, let me see if I-
That was for Imani.
Yes, I think the first question was for Imani, and it was about how we can move away from entrepreneurship as a fallback, and so that what is the suggestion idea for people to go beyond entrepreneurship as a fallback? What are the solutions? And I think what are the solutions he was asking for to address that issue?
Thank you. Well, I think the industrialization is a complicated concept, particularly in light of the existential threat of climate change. And so trying to balance out how countries develop while also ensuring that they're responsible stewards of the environment is something to be figured out. I have every confidence that governments working in coalition with the UN, ECA, UNECA, think tanks can figure that out. In fact, I know that work has already been done in terms of trying to figure out how you move the development, needle forward in ways that reflect the respect for the environment and overall people's needs. So, I think that that's the big question. How do you create work, decent work, so that people don't have to be, right, these quote unquote micro entrepreneurs? Now, there are people who do see that as their calling, right? There are people who work in the informal economy and they think it's wonderful and flexible, just like you see people here in the United States who will go to work for Lyft or Uber or DoorDash or whatever, and they like the flexibility. But most people are driven to those options because they need money, and they don't like the fact that they have no social protections. They don't like the fact that they're part of this sort of faceless system where they are a cog in a wheel and have very little control, right? And so we recognize this in the States, right? And there are many worker organizations that are attempting to address these issues. So is the case on the continent as well. But the big challenge is around sustainable development, creation of industries, the ability to harness African resources for African development. While I mentioned only in passing this issue of illicit financial flows, this is huge. We're talking about $80+ billion a year leaving the African continent. And when you pull apart, okay, so what are these illicit financial flows? 60% come from corporate commercial activity. So we're talking about multinational corporations that do not pay tax, they avoid paying tax, or they pay no tax at all. We're talking about extractive industry corporations who who undervalue the commodities that they're taking out of the continent and therefore pay little to no tax, and then sell it on these commodities on the open market, and the money just goes into tax havens that benefit corporations. You know, we're talking about systems. One can use like broad terms of imperialism and so forth. What is, I think, more helpful at this point in time is to begin to deconstruct those words, to figure out the exact ways in which resources are literally being stolen from the African continent. And they are literally being stolen in very sophisticated ways.
Okay, thank you. Are they?
Yeah, if
Yes, go
I,
ahead, Prof.
okay. If I may add to really this powerful response from Imani Countess to the question of how to use political consciousness and to address issues, even from the point of view of hip hop artists. I want to underscore that many of these hip hop artists are, interestingly, medical students who are using their knowledge of what is happening in the medical field and the disenfranchisement of Africans from resources to articulate a question of social justice and impart public health, healthy public health discourses, messages that are life-saving. But in addition to that, these are artists who are aware of the histories, such as the history of the Congos, the history of how the Sahel and what is happening in the extractive industries, and trying to appeal, create a literacy discourse that's really built on the neo-colonialism, and then intersected what it means where you incapacitate Africans by denying them the right to life, the right to dignity, the right to have access to food sovereignty, by allowing Africans to have access to land, access to water, and access to employment, as mentioned by Imani. And nobody wants to stay in a permanent stage of being educated with degrees and become jobless. So these are the kind of discourses that come out when we listen carefully to the lyrics. I want to share the kind of work. So please, for instance, when you look at the work of Dr. Olajide Williams here at New York, at Columbia University, and also in the city of New York, using hip hop as a way of raising awareness about right to health to underprivileged communities. You have a student from when the COVID strike out, African students living in at the theater of the pandemic in Wuhan, who are medical students who have produced hip hop songs to try to inform African population in indigenous African languages to understand what is at stake in a time where African governments were not really quick in terms of imagining and being quick in responding creatively to critical health literacy, built on history of how African public health has been under attack from the colonial era to the post-colonial dispensation. So these are very important critics who knows history, who knows what it means to live in in neo-colonial slavery and also to learn from the lesson of Jim Crow, to try to see what does it mean to relate as a people of African descent, whether in Africa or in the US or in China or in Europe, anywhere in the world. And they're speaking directly also to African political elite, disenfranchising African intelligence, because these are people in the medical field. These are people like us in this platform, trying to inform African government of the problem of the neoliberal policies. And that has a long durée. We go back to slavery, and the continuous manifestation of incapacitating African people by denying them access to economic resources. So when the extractive industries come in the place, the issue is not to have trade, but the issue is to have fair trade, which will allow Africans to use the benefit of the revenue from a fair trade, which does not pollute the environment, to try to empower Africans in a meaningful way, in a dignified way. If you are looking at what uranium extraction does in places like the Sahel, in Niger, or in Mozambique, or any other places where we have this extractive industry, it has also affected a local from accessing water. Because the extractive, in order to mine uranium, you need water. And this is the subterranean waters that is needed in order from agriculture in the Sahel-Sahara region, in the oases, to work, whether it is in Libya, southern Libya, Algeria, Niger, or it is in Mozambique. We are dealing at a really violation of human rights, human dignity, at a really fundamental level. So if you go into the oases that produce food in the Sahel region, the Sahara region, today agriculture is not possible because of the way that extractive industry pollutes. So you have a question of slow death because of also exposure. When people drink contaminated waters, it is slow death in the sense that you have to study oncology. Professor Julie Livingston has really a powerful book on looking at what happened in terms of oncology related to mining in many African countries, like in Southern Africa. That lesson should also be helpful for the Sahel and the other region. So there is a consciousness. What the work I'm doing is to try to see that it is important to not dismiss the work of the artists, because these artists are really critical thinkers who draw on history, who draw on policies. They are people in economics. There are people who are activists who are trying to help both bring also the ways that the disenfranchised communities in the margins, in the urban periphery of poverty and rural areas that are invisibilized in terms of giving them public access to voice their condition. These artists are bringing that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Okay, so with that, we'll have Julialynne wrap up quickly before we go to lunch. We have no question online so far.
Okay. From the 60s, we had the slogan, same struggle, same fight. It's as true today as it was then. And for those of us who are fighting the U.S. Department of Agriculture in terms of the policies that are being set for many of the states to follow, the same U.S. Department of Agriculture is setting the policies for Africa that are being followed under the USAID. After lunch, we'll have a panel on coercive diplomacy, and it's as true in the field of food and food sovereignty as it is in other areas. And so, just very quickly, point one, in terms of entrepreneurs, again, the statistics bear it out that the majority of food production, not only in Africa, but around the world, is done by small and micro farmers. And the majority of the small and micro farmers are women. So unless we address the needs of women and the conditions of women, we will not be able to actually meet the needs of food production that will be in the interest of security for our communities. There are many discussions about urban agriculture, the value of urban agriculture. You talked about some of the changes or options or alternatives. We look at Detroit. People are not asking for permission in Detroit. They're simply taking the land. In Cleveland, it's been documented that the urban agriculture in Cleveland, in many areas, is sufficient to provide over 50% of the needs of the population in Cleveland. In Columbus, and again, I'm deciding the representatives of Midwest, we're following a vertical integration model where people providing basic education, providing a context in which people can actually farm, and as farming moving from farming to pleasure, to farming for commercial production, and then being able to have control of the post-harvest process through actual marketplace, because consistently, again, right now in the United States, farmers markets and urban process of distribution is controlled by middle-class white women. And so it's a very strong competitive process in terms of being able to break to and say, these are the cultural issues, these are the relationships that we are building on historically that are important for us to continue to recognize and have. So I will stop there, and I'm going to thank Mario for chairing, and then say that it is 1:35. And it would be really good if we could eat and be back here no later than 2, please.